April 1945, the Philippine island of Luzon. The jungle still smelled of cordite and smoke. Palm fronds hung limp in the humid air, shredded by mortar fire that had ceased only hours before. Beneath a makeshift canvas shelter strung between bullet-scarred trees, 17 Japanese women sat in silence, their white nurse uniforms stained brown with mud and dried blood. Their hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from terror. They had been taught, drilled, conditioned to believe that capture by the Americans meant only one fate: violation, torture, and death. Now, surrounded by armed soldiers speaking a language they barely understood, they waited for the inevitable brutality their officers had promised would come. One nurse, a 23-year-old woman named Kimiko Yamaguchi, pressed her back against the trunk of a coconut palm and closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's letters, carefully folded in her pocket, now likely lost forever. She thought of the soldiers she had tended in field hospitals across the Pacific, men who had whispered prayers to the emperor before dying, men who had detonated grenades rather than surrender. She had seen what happened when Japanese forces overran enemy positions. She had heard the stories from Nanking, from Manila, from a dozen other cities where mercy was a forgotten word. And now, she believed, it was her turn to face the same merciless reckoning. But what Kimiko and her fellow nurses did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that the American soldiers approaching their shelter carried not weapons, but medical supplies, and the orders they followed came not from a manual of vengeance, but from the Geneva Conventions and a military doctrine that still, even in the savage crucible of the Pacific War, distinguished between combatant and caregiver, between soldier and healer. The war in the Pacific had become a conflict unlike any other in modern history. By the spring of 1945, 4 years of island-hopping campaigns had revealed a clash not merely of armies, but of incompatible worldviews. Japanese soldiers had been raised on the Senjinkun military code, which declared that capture was the ultimate dishonor, a stain so profound that death was preferable to surrender. The code was explicit: never suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. Soldiers carried cyanide capsules. Civilians on Saipan threw themselves from cliffs rather than face American occupation, and the propaganda that flowed from Tokyo painted the enemy as savage beasts, white demons who would torture prisoners, defile women, and desecrate the dead. This was not mere rhetoric, it was doctrine, reinforced by every layer of Japanese military culture. Officers told their men that Americans scalped prisoners and wore their ears as trophies. Newsreels showed fabricated atrocities. Even nurses, women trained in the healing arts, were taught that their medical knowledge would make them targets for unspeakable abuse. Better to die with honor, the instructors said, than to live in shame. The American forces advancing through the Philippines in 1945 had seen the consequences of this indoctrination. Wounded Japanese soldiers would feign surrender, then detonate grenades when medics approached. Civilians leapt into the sea clutching their children. Hospitals became battlegrounds when Japanese troops refused evacuation. And yet, beneath the horror and the mutual savagery, the American military clung to a principle that seemed almost absurd in its idealism. Prisoners of war, once disarmed, were to be treated humanely. Medical personnel, explicitly protected under international law, were to receive care before punishment, if punishment was even warranted. When American forces overran the Japanese field hospital near Baguio in mid-April, they expected resistance. What they found instead were the 17 nurses huddled and silent, their eyes wide with the certainty of imminent death. The commanding officer, Captain Robert Hayes of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, surveyed the scene and made a decision that would have seemed incomprehensible to his Japanese counterparts. He holstered his sidearm, called for his medical team, and ordered the nurses to be examined and treated for injuries. The nurses did not understand what was happening. When the first American medic approached, a young corpsman named Daniel Reeves, Kimiko flinched and turned her face away. Reeves crouched low, held up his empty hands and pointed to a gash on her forearm, still seeping blood from shrapnel. He spoke no Japanese, she spoke no English, but he unrolled a bandage, and with slow, deliberate movements, he began to clean the wound. Kimiko's breath came in shallow gasps. She waited for the pain, the cruelty, the betrayal. Instead, she felt the sting of antiseptic and the gentle pressure of gauze being wrapped around her arm. Across the shelter, other medics worked with the same quiet efficiency. One nurse had a broken collarbone, sustained when the field hospital collapsed under artillery fire. An American doctor set the bone and fashioned a sling from spare cloth. Another nurse had developed a fever from an infected leg wound. Penicillin, that miraculous drug still rare in Japanese medical supplies, was administered without hesitation. The Americans moved among the captured women not as conquerors, but as colleagues in a profession that transcended nationality. It was this inversion of expectation, this collision between what they had been promised and what they now witnessed, that shattered the psychological armor the nurses had worn for years. They had been told the Americans were animals. And yet, here were men who bandaged wounds before asking questions, who offered water before demanding names. The cognitive dissonance was profound, almost unbearable. Some of the nurses wept, not from relief but from the destabilizing realization that everything they had been taught was a lie. The historical record captures the transformation in stark detail. In the weeks following their capture, the Japanese nurses were transferred to a prisoner of war camp near Manila, where they were interviewed by American intelligence officers and Japanese-speaking interpreters. The transcripts of these interviews, declassified decades later, reveal a pattern of astonishment and confusion. "We were treated as human beings," one nurse told an interviewer. "We could not believe it. We had been told that surrender meant death, but instead we were given medicine and food. We did not know how to understand this." The food in particular became a symbol of American abundance that the nurses struggled to reconcile with their previous beliefs. Japanese military rations in the final year of the war had deteriorated into starvation fare: moldy rice, weevil-infested grain, seaweed soup so thin it barely qualified as sustenance. The nurses themselves had often gone without meals to preserve supplies for wounded soldiers. And now, in the prisoner camp, they were served rations that seemed obscene in their generosity: canned beef, white bread, powdered milk, even chocolate bars. One nurse in her interview described holding a Hershey's bar and weeping because she could not comprehend a nation that could afford to give such luxuries to its enemies. The medical care continued. The nurses, many of whom suffered from malnutrition and tropical diseases, were examined by American doctors who treated them with the same protocols used for U.S. personnel. Malaria was combated with quinine, dysentery was addressed with sulfur drugs, dental infections were treated, not ignored. This was not mercy born of sentimentality, it was policy, rooted in the American military's adherence to the laws of war and a pragmatic understanding that well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence and posed less risk of disease spreading through camps. But beyond policy, there was something else at work. Many of the American medics and doctors had been raised in a culture that, for all its flaws and contradictions, still held to the ideal that certain principles were universal. The Hippocratic Oath did not distinguish between nationalities. The Red Cross conventions applied to all. And the belief that even in war some lines should not be crossed, some decencies preserved, was a tenet that had survived the descent into total war. For the Japanese nurses, the experience was nothing less than ideological collapse. They had been raised in a society where the emperor was divine, where obedience was sacred, where the collective mattered infinitely more than the individual. The propaganda had reinforced these beliefs with a portrait of the enemy as barbaric and godless. And yet, the Americans who captured them did not behave like the monsters they had been promised. Instead, they behaved, paradoxically, with a kind of mundane professionalism that was somehow more disorienting than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they had prepared for. Kindness, or at least impartial medical competence, they had no framework to process. Kimiko Yamaguchi, in her post-war memoir published in Japan in 1952, wrote of the moment she realized the full extent of the deception. It came not during the initial treatment, but days later, when an American doctor noticed that she was limping and insisted on examining her foot. She had been injured weeks earlier and had ignored the wound, believing that as a prisoner she had no right to care, no standing to ask for help. The doctor, an older man with greying hair, cleaned the infection, applied a dressing, and then did something that Kimiko described as the turning point. He smiled at her. Not with condescension or pity, but with the simple, weary camaraderie of one medical professional acknowledging another. "In that moment," she wrote, "I understood that we had been lied to, not about small things, but about the nature of the world itself." The symbolism of the stethoscope became central to the nurses' later reflections. Several of the captured nurses mentioned in their interviews and writings that the American doctors allowed them to continue practicing their profession within the camp, tending to other Japanese prisoners under supervision. They were issued medical supplies, bandages, antiseptics, basic instruments. And among these supplies, the stethoscope became an object of almost totemic significance. In Japanese military hospitals, stethoscopes had been scarce, often shared among multiple nurses or unavailable entirely. Now, in captivity, they were given their own instruments, functional and new. The stethoscope represented more than medical practice. It symbolized a recognition of their identity as healers, a validation that had been stripped from them the moment they were taught to prioritize propaganda over profession. To listen to a heartbeat, whether of a Japanese soldier or an American guard, was to participate in an act that transcended ideology. The heart does not beat in Japanese or English. It beats in the universal rhythm of life, indifferent to flags and emperors and manifestos. This was the silent revolution occurring in the minds of the captured nurses, the realization that the principles they had been taught to despise, individualism, legalism, the notion of inalienable rights, were not weaknesses but strengths. The Americans treated them well not because they were soft, but because they believed, even imperfectly, in a system that constrained power and demanded accountability. The Geneva Conventions, which Japan had signed but never ratified, were not abstractions to the US military. They were rules that commanders enforced, that medics followed, that shaped behavior even in the chaos of war. The broader implications of this encounter rippled far beyond 17 nurses. In the years following the war, historians and sociologists studying Japanese repatriation noted a pattern among prisoners who had been held by American forces. Unlike those who experienced Soviet captivity in Manchuria, where conditions were brutal and survival rates low, the Japanese POWs in American camps often returned home with a transformed perspective on the Western powers. They spoke of abundance, of legal protections, of medical care that exceeded what they had received in their own military. Some became advocates for democratic reform during the occupation. Others carried a quiet private disillusionment with the militarist ideology that had sent them to war. The nurses, in particular, became symbolic figures in post-war Japan. Their stories, though often suppressed, during the immediate post-war years when shame over defeat ran deep, eventually emerged in memoirs, interviews, and academic studies. They represented a kind of double transformation. First, the shattering of their indoctrination by the reality of American behavior, and second, their reintegration into a society that was itself grappling with the collapse of its wartime beliefs. Kimiko Yamaguchi returned to nursing in post-war Tokyo. She worked in hospitals rebuilt with American aid using medical techniques learned from translated US textbooks. She never spoke publicly about her political views, but her colleagues noted that she kept on her desk a small photograph, a group portrait taken at the Manila POW camp, showing her and her fellow nurses standing alongside American medical officers. The photograph was faded, the edges worn, but she kept it visible, a silent testament to the moment when her understanding of the world shifted irrevocably. The legacy of that April day in Luzon is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, the choice to honor principle over expediency can alter the trajectory of lives. The American medics who treated the Japanese nurses were not saints. They were tired, often angry, men who had seen their friends die in brutal combat. They had every reason to view the enemy as less than human, to give in to the vengeful impulses that war nurtures. And yet they followed their orders, which were grounded in a belief, however imperfectly realized, that the laws of war mattered, that medical ethics transcended nationality, that even enemies retained some measure of dignity. For the nurses, the experience was a wound and a healing all at once. It wounded their faith in the system that had sent them to war. It healed, or at least began to heal, their capacity to see beyond the propagandized hatreds that had defined their youth. They learned that abundance need not be decadence, that legalism need not be weakness, that individualism need not mean selfishness. They learned, most of all, that the enemy they had feared was not monstrous but human, flawed, contradictory, capable of both terrible violence and unexpected grace. In the end, the story of the Japanese POW nurses is not about the superiority of one nation over another. It is about the enduring power of humane treatment to dismantle ideologies built on fear and lies. It is about the stubborn insistence, even in the midst of total war, that some principles are worth preserving. And it is a reminder that the most profound victories are not won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when mercy is chosen over cruelty, when a bandage is wrapped around an enemy's wound, when a stethoscope is placed over a heart that beats with the same fragile persistence as any other. The palms still sway over that shelter in Luzon, though the canvas is long gone and the jungle has reclaimed the clearing. But the memory endures, carried forward in faded photographs and translated memoirs, a testament to the truth that even in war's darkest hour, the simple act of treating a human being as human can shatter empires built on hatred and lies.